Hi, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, is it time to relocate at-risk coastal communities to higher, drier ground?
Scientists are warning by 2040 a once-in-a-century storm could become an annual event for some of our coastal communities as sea levels continue to rise.
Already this year, heavy rain, flooding and cyclones have battered our coastal communities.
Cyclone Vaianu has left our shores, but its impact will be felt for a long time to come in some coastal communities.
I'm standing here at Te Araroa on the east coast. The road behind me is impassable. It's covered in woody debris and floodwater.
Entire neighbourhoods underwater, trees where they shouldn't be.
Another week and another massive storm tearing up swathes of New Zealand.
The closures on state highways 35 and 2 this week have once again impacted growers in Tairāwhiti.
A war zone is how storm damage on the east coast of the North Island is being described. A group of 7 people, including children, survived hours clinging to the roof of their home in rising floodwater.
They are having conversations within those iwi to say, hey, listen, this is the 7th or 8th time we've been smashed by these sort of events. Maybe we've got to have some braver conversations about where we might relocate to.
But exactly how does that work? What are the logistics? What are the costs and challenges? And what happens if they don't want to leave? Today, I talked to Professor Jonathan Boston from Victoria University. He specialises in climate change, including managed retreat and coastal relocation.
I think the emotional and psychological dimensions of this are absolutely crucial. And one of the things we need to come to terms with is that we are going to be faced with very significant loss, a loss of really valuable cultural assets. It may be cemeteries, Urapa, or it may be a very special place from a spiritual perspective in terms of some significant event, or where a marae has been based for a long time, or where a church has been based for a long time. There will be, very significant losses that we are going to have to come to terms with. We will simply lose prominent landmarks that people have valued over very long periods of time. And that is something that, as a society, we are going to have to talk about and address up front, in my view, and be very, very honest about. And indeed coping with that loss. The loss of place is really a fundamental part of this whole really tragic problem that we're grappling with, Amanda. And I don't see any easy answers. I would say very quickly, however, that if we don't have a really well-developed, integrated, holistic, systematic planning process which is inclusive and participatory and involves people and which has really good, rich information available to people and gets people to understand the nature of the risks that are going to be faced and the options that are available potentially, if we don't have that kind of planning process in which people feel involved and can have some sort of sense of ownership of their future, then I think that will be very, very bad. And as part of that, if we don't have adequate funding instruments that enable people to have a secure future, rather than simply losing everything, losing their business, losing their home and so on, maybe losing their farm or whatever it might be, if we don't have a planning process and a funding process that facilitates people being able to move on and get on with their lives, then, well, we will simply have colossal maladaptation and a great deal more harm and suffering than would otherwise be necessary.
So in 2026, our government, our councils, are they moving fast enough on this, Jonathan?
No, definitely not.
He'll explain why in a moment, and I'll also catch up with Gisborne Mayor Rehet Stoltz about the potential relocation of East Coast towns. Her region has been battered, cut off and isolated again this week.
If you take a look at Gisborne or Tairāwhiti in the last 4 or 5 years, we are rushing from one event to another. We are at this stage not having those longer term discussions. At this stage, it feels to me a little bit like whack-a-mole, where we are as a nation but also as a region addressing issues as they pop up and dealing with them.
More from the Mayor shortly. But first, let's get back to Professor Jonathan Boston, who says the point of managed retreats or relocations is to get people out of harm's way, with the harm typically being climate change related. The government is involved in the move and management and usually buys out properties. So, in the current climate, are relocations now unavoidable?
The short answer is yes. Given the evidence we have from the scientific community about the kinds of impacts that climate change will have, both on the more severe sort of weather events, including more severe precipitation events and thus more severe flooding, but also as a result of sea level rise over the coming centuries, probably, we're going to be faced with increasing numbers of properties and communities and towns, particularly on coasts, but also in riverine areas, that are going to be increasingly exposed to significant risk. And right across the world, we are going to have to engage in the really difficult, challenging process of moving these vulnerable communities out of harm's way. In some cases, it will be possible and cost-effective to protect communities. But particularly in relation to sea level rise, most of the communities that are going to be vulnerable will not be able to be protected in a cost-effective way, or it may not even be technically possible to protect them.
I want to talk logistics in a sec, but who actually makes the decision? Is it the government, the council, scientists? Who actually says, right, it's time for you to get out?
Well, if it's a managed process as opposed to an unmanaged process, then some level of government will be making that decision. The scale and scope of the managed retreat will probably need to dictate the extent of governmental involvement and the level of that government involvement. So, for example, if you're moving a relatively small coastal community, a beachside community like Amberley Beach, the likelihood is that the relevant territorial authority and or regional government, if we have regional governments in the future, will be in a position to manage that process with only modest, if any, central government assistance. On the other hand, if you're talking about moving whole towns like Westport, for example, or significant parts of a large suburb like South Dunedin, then it seems to me highly likely that you're going to need central government involvement in various ways, not least because there will be central government property at stake. There'll be schools, healthcare facilities, there'll obviously be roads and other public infrastructure in which the central government has an interest that will be at stake. So the central government will almost certainly want to be involved. And in one of the critical issues, Amanda, that we need to address in this context is who pays for what and on what basis.
Exactly, yes. That's a huge one. And who does pay for what and on what basis?
Yes. Well, the problem we've had over the last 10 years or more as governments, researchers and other stakeholders have been debating these matters is that everybody wants someone else to pay. So central government wants local government and property owners to pay. Local government wants central government and or property owners to pay, and of course property owners want one or other level of government to pay. And the problem we've got is that in the case of local government, in many cases, if not most cases, local governments are going to lack simply the financial resources for significant scale managed retreat. And if we don't have central government funding assistance, then plainly it's going to be very, very difficult to move particularly poorer communities out of harm's way. Because people simply won't have the wherewithal, they won't have the resources. Their properties will have little of any value, they'll be uninsurable, they may well have mortgages that they can't service. And so if we don't have some kind of property buyout arrangement, albeit with caps and various forms of conditionality attached, if we don't have that, and only that can be funded really by central government, if we don't have that, we're going to be faced with unmanaged retreat. And we're going to be faced with more significant and serious harm because if people can't move, they're going to be in harm's way.
And are we talking ballpark here? Millions, billions, tens of billions? You know, what are we talking to? Even a small town versus a big town relocation?
Okay, so much depends on the time frame we're talking about. The cost in the near term, by which I mean, say, 5 to 10 years, is probably going to be at most in the billions. If you're looking out 100 years or 150 years, where we may be talking about moving tens of thousands, if not potentially hundreds of thousands of people, if we have multi-metre sea level rise, then clearly you're going to be talking about tens of billions, possibly hundreds of billions. So it does depend very much on the time frame, and it depends also on what happens globally, whether we as a global community manage to mitigate climate change more rapidly over the coming decade or so than we have hitherto. And it's also going to depend on the extent to which we can prevent people building in areas that are going to be vulnerable in the future to climate change related hazards. And it's also going to be related to the extent to which we invest in cost-effective protection where that is technically feasible and proper to do. And then in addition, we need to bear in mind, as we've witnessed in recent years, the cost of the damage that is done together with the costs of recovery and rebuilding. That cost is also going to rise over time. So we're going to be faced not only with the cost of actual impacts, which will be potentially billions of dollars annually in the future, but also the cost of moving people out of harm's way. So this is going to be, unfortunately, an incredibly costly part of the future that current generations and future generations are going to have to cope with.
And get their minds around, okay, we've decided that a town is going to move. Where do they go to? And then what are the logistics that follow that?
So this is going to depend very, very much on the scope and scale and the particular characteristics of the community affected. So if you just take a few examples, you could look at a small beach community like Amberley Beach, where you're talking about perhaps several hundred properties at the most, and where there is potential to move inland to an area that is currently unoccupied, and in an area where there is the potential for value uplift of the value of the land because there will be other people wanting to come and live in that part of the community or part of the country. You could take a small town or smallish town like Westport, where you've got, say, 4,000 people, a couple of thousand properties, residential properties, and several hundred businesses. If that was to move as a whole community, well, it would obviously have to move to a place further inland, and there is land available. But the logistics of that will obviously be vastly more complicated than moving a small beachside community, because there will be schools and other social services, health services involved. There will be a need for, very significant expenditure on infrastructure. My understanding is that the infrastructure costs alone of kind of building a new Westport would be at least $1 billion, quite apart from probably the billion or more needed for building a couple of thousand new homes. And then you've got perhaps the most challenging situations, at least for New Zealand, which would be what happens to the future of the capital city, Wellington. If we end up with really significant sea level rise, by which I mean more than a metre or more, then plainly the CBD of Wellington will be highly vulnerable and exposed to flooding, and that will have enormously costly implications for the buildings in the current CBD area, and obviously for all manner of public infrastructure, water services, electricity, roading, the railway network, and so on and so on.
The East Coast, it's just been battered and hit again and again and again.
Cyclone Vanu's caused widespread chaos across the North Island, with powerful winds and a deluge of rain. Slips blocking roads next to swollen rivers, severing important connections between communities. The storm whipping seas along the east coast of the country into a frenzy, making it dangerous to be on or near the coast.
The likelihood of relocations up there, and sort of what happens?
Yes, so tragically there are going to be parts of coasts that are going to be the subject of really, really difficult conversations, and they will focus in not just on whether to move long-standing communities, including marae and all manner of valuable cultural assets, but also actually whether governments continue to maintain a roading network that would enable those communities actually to continue to survive, let alone flourish. The sheer costs of road maintenance in the context of more severe flooding events, more severe slips, more frequent slips, and so on, there are going to be, I'm sure, places where the question will have to be raised: do we continue to provide road access? And if so, how? Who's going to pay? Because it's going to be a significant challenge. So I'm mindful that in some situations there may be no choice but for governmental authorities to enforce some kind of relocation because of the severity of the risks that the community may face.
Just this week, the Prime Minister told Morning Report that East Coast iwi are looking at relocations.
they are having conversations within those iwi to say, hey, listen, this is the 7th or 8th time we've been smashed by these sort of events. Maybe we've got to have some braver conversations about where we might relocate to.
I was surprised because I have not been part of those discussions.
That's Gisborne Mayor Rehet Stoltz, who plans to follow up on those relocation discussions. But her priority right now is looking after her district, which was cut off and isolated again this week.
I am very, very angry, and I'm just getting more and more angry that overall it feels to me we have not invested in the resilience into our region. We've always just kept things together with a bit of spit and a sticky plaster. And we also need proper investment in our state highways, just like Wellington, Christchurch. So it's easy to say, we might need to evacuate. But I do think we need to be honest and say, have we really invested well in the last 50, 60 years?
Parts of the Tairāwhiti region are still cut off and isolated after torrential rain and flooding.
The chunk of State Highway 2 between Opotiki and Matawai has been closed for more than 2 weeks, with 40 work sites along the road, including 8 spots with severe damage due to slips and flooding.
So relocation not quite yet a reality for your district just yet?
We have not had those discussions with our communities. I know that the government are talking about adaptation frameworks and that there will be maps available. And I do agree with them that we will in future need to have those discussions. We haven't had those discussions as a community yet. And Amanda, you know our community. It's a huge region. People forget it's not Gisborne town. You can drive 4 hours north and you're still in our region, and then you can drive an hour west and an hour south. It's a huge region with unique communities everywhere. And we owe it to our communities to have those discussions amongst themselves and then make those decisions themselves alongside the government and alongside local government.
And a lot of these places, they have very deep cultural and whakapapa ties. I mean, how do you even begin to ask these people to leave their land?
Since yesterday morning, I've spoken to 4 or 5 Ngāti Porou friends, and I said to them, can they let me know if these discussions are happening or not? And all 5 of them said, you can't remove Ngāti Porou from the whenua. That is who we are. So those discussions are not for us to be had. It is for the people who have the link to that land and the whakapapa and the connection to that land to have those discussions and make decisions accordingly. It is not just let's up and go. That is part of who Ngāti Porou is. David Seymour spoke about the adaptation frameworks yesterday, and what the government's role is and what local government's role is to have information available for communities to make those decisions. Because communities, there are generational links to whenua, and we need to respect that. And so at this stage, I won't say we are even thinking of those discussions yet. There are still a lot of steps and a lot of information gathering before we get there.
And you'd have a fight on your hands, you reckon, if the government came in and said, right, time for you to go, you need to relocate, this is simply too dangerous?
I think the government would know that is not the way to go. There would be a lot of opposition. And I also know that the government would want to do it the right way because it's a big discussion for New Zealand to have, and you want to do it the right way.
Governments of all political persuasions have been dragging their feet on the challenges of adaptation. And it's totally understandable. There are very few votes in climate change one way or another, actually, whether it's mitigation or adaptation. Essentially, governments are looking at, a rather grim future with ever-increasing costs. And governments which are currently facing significant fiscal hurdles, low growth, low productivity growth and so on, you can imagine why they are reluctant to be, wanting to commit themselves to potentially significant additional fiscal expenditure going forward, not just for a few years, but decades, if not centuries.
He says the coalition government has delivered a national policy statement on natural hazards, and last year the National Adaptation Framework was announced. He says these are steps in the right direction.
My fundamental concern about all this is that some of the philosophical underpinnings of the current government's approach are highly questionable. They seem to be wedded to a view that so-called beneficiaries of adaptation should pay. It's not entirely clear to me who the beneficiaries are going to be. I think people in Westport, if they're asked to leave, they're not going to see themselves as beneficiaries. They'll see themselves as victims. We've got a government that essentially wants to put most of the burden, if not all the burden, basically onto individual property owners and communities, and I just don't see that as being a viable option. And we've got a government that seems to assume that if you give people enough good, reliable scientific information, they will make really good use of that information and they will act rationally. And what we know from a very long, sad experience across humanity over many, many decades, if not centuries, and from many, many studies, we know that unfortunately people manage risk rather badly, and particularly risks that they're not familiar with and that are kind of out of scope from their previous experience. So if you're operating on the basis of some highly questionable behavioural assumptions and some really questionable values and some very, if you like, ideological commitments to minimising government expenditure, I think you're going to end up with a very, very unsatisfactory set of policies that will ultimately result in much greater long-term costs for society as a whole than would otherwise be the case. So, we're going to have to come to terms with an ongoing transformative process. If we simply put our heads in the sand, so to speak, and refuse to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the problem we're faced with, well, it's going to be, frankly, disastrous, economically, socially, ecologically, culturally, spiritually, in all manner of ways.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Jonathan Boston and Rehet Stoltz. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Binge. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.